Global warming has caused increases in extreme heat events and heat waves. The heat waves in Australia has caused at least 354 deaths over the last 2 decades. Local planners are addressing these issues by visualizing where action needs to be prioritized by using heat vulnerability map. So at first I thought, this is what I want to do, making a heat vulnerability map for Brimbank, which is one of the major city and one of the hottest area in Melbourne West. However, as I was trying to find which framework to use, I found out that there are a lot of frameworks. So which one should I follow? As we have learned in class, if you have any climate-related questions, you can always refer back to the leading organizations, which is the IPCC. But just like the Spider-Man meme, the current studies have remained fragmented, following 2 dominant vulnerability approach by the IPCC. The first one is the older one. In the assessment report 4, vulnerability is a mix of people's sensitivity, their ability to cope, and also the magnitude of heat. Later on, in the assessment report 5 and 6, vulnerability is defined as people adaptive capacity and their sensitivity, which exclude the exposure, the magnitude of heat. This shift has caused a lot of confusion for researchers and practitioners, which risks misaligning vulnerability with adaptation action. However, there has been a lack of studies comparing these 2 approaches spatially. This is where my study fills the gap. My research focuses on 2 main questions. First, how different IPCC-based approaches shape the way we visualize heat vulnerability, and which framework is ultimately more usable and interpretable for local planning. Interestingly, using the equally weighted method, I find that the AR4 vulnerability map has more similar patterns to the AR5 heat risk map rather than the AR5 vulnerability map. Also, left with the question, is the intensity of heat itself only increases the risk and not people's vulnerability? I also found that the AR4 approach is more usable because it shows where heat and people interacts. For planners, this can help with on-ground intervention, such as where to provide the cooling infrastructure. This study also calls us to rethink the map, because misplaced vulnerability leads to misplaced action. To plan for heat, we must step out of the pixels and understand the people. Thank you.
There were 3 murders in 10 months, muggings, thefts, and homes surrounded by broken glass and graffiti. During the 1980s, this was the life of the residents in the North Richmond public housing estate, feeling, and I quote from one interviewee, like they were the dregs of society, but not due to their own volition, because of abandonment by the Ministry of Housing. Despite this, many were proud of their home and wanted to take a stance against institutional neglect and make a change in their community. In 1981 and again in 1984, the residents went on a rent strike to protest to the Ministry of Housing about conditions on the estate. They withheld $250,000 until their demands were met. My thesis uncovered this largely forgotten story by examining documents held in archives around Victoria and collecting oral histories from those who were involved. My main research question was, how did they manage to do this twice, to take on such a formidable and bureaucratic institution? My first finding was that it was due to the establishment of the North Richmond Tenants' Council. Created in 1979, it was the only one of its kind in Victoria and was designed to provide representation for the tenants by the tenants, with the ultimate goal of achieving tenant self-control on all matters on the estate. Described by one commentator as Richmond's Little United Nations due to their meticulous method of ensuring representation across all the cultural groups, it was the Tenants' Council which led the charge in negotiations with the ministry and built solidarity among the community. But they couldn't do this alone. The 1980s came off a wave of activism and reform in the 60s and 70s, which was pushing for change in the housing sector. Just to name a few groups, you had Shelter, the Tenants' Union of Victoria, the Housing Commission Tenants' Union, the Squatters' Union, and many others. It was and still is a very small world with a lot of overlap, and it was through forming connections and making alliances that the strikers were able to build momentum and gain attention in the press. The residents were successful both times. In 1981, they prevented extra service charges from being imposed, and in 1984, the biggest strike, they secured just shy of $1 million from the state government to go towards security upgrades on the estate. So you might ask, if it was so successful, why was it forgotten? And this was something that saddened many of my interviewees. I found that housing struggles, in particular those of the poor and working class, are not as well documented in comparison to true traditional labour movements. And this reflects broader structural inequalities in how historical narratives are constructed, preserved, and transmitted. This story of a community rising up against those in power continues to hold relevance in today's very own housing crisis and provides important lessons for those who want to fight back.
Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Elliot Liu, and my research topic is about land use planning for climatic risk interactions, with a specific focus on the 2019 to 2020 East Gippsland bushfires. My research supervisor is Professor Adam March. Under the changing climate, the protracting El Nino southern oscillation periods foreshadow the shortening intervals and more frequent interactions between hazardous events. Like the chain reactions within the nuclear fission, climatic risk escalation is resulted from the interactions between hazardous events and human systems. By regulating the overall functions of human settlement, therefore, planning plays an important role in the hazard risk management. However, the role of land use planning within the risk interaction management and vice versa has not been sufficiently discussed in the existing body of research. Therefore, to mitigate the knowledge gap, I'm questioning how does the Victorian land use planning system manage climatic risk interactions that's relevant to the 2019 to 2020 East Gippsland bushfires. My empirical data were collected from 8 semi-structured interviews, 21 policy documents, and a case law made by the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. Based on reflexive semantic analysis, 4 themes comprising 137 codes were identified. In East Gippsland, my research found that despite an all-hazard type and all-risk cycle management approach was generally acknowledged at the policy level, planning practice was inherently hazard type-based, emergency-focused, with insufficient risk mitigation-oriented systematic transformation happen after the bushfire season. The active Victorian bushfire planning approaches rely upon the integrated efforts between building and planning systems. As the only planning control, bushfire management overlay only covers high bushfire hazard areas. With the absence of the BMO, therefore, the effectiveness of this double system-based and single planning control approach can be effectively diminished within the existing bushfire-prone communities. Furthermore, within the neoliberal-inspired democratic planning system, the plurality of planning objectives held by plurality of governments with their short-term political cycle can create inherent difficulties for the long-term climatic risk management. The statewide codification to planning regulations, costly planning scheme amendments, and data sharing barriers between public and private institutions can intensify the existing disparities between policy intention and practical implementation at regional councils with limited resources. To conclude, under the changing climate, development and deployment of a more rigorous risk interaction planning approaches are imperative within the Shire of East Gippsland and the Victorian land use planning system. Thanks so much for your listening.
Good evening. I'm Fadlan Sahid, and this is my story. I have really liked airplanes for my whole life. Every time I see airplanes, and also every time I fly from Melbourne, I'm always excited to, of course, see airplanes and also looking at Melbourne's sprawling skylines. The view is amazing with lots of dwellings, sprawling urban landscapes, for sure. However, I just wonder, how can residents there access public transport and services? Because everything seems far away from each other. You don't want to walk for more than 2 kilometers only to access those facilities, do you? I then fell in love with urban consolidation. It is an idea to densify urban development and also by locating more housing closer to jobs, transports, and services to control Melbourne's outward urban expansion. And this is the Victorian government's intention through Activity Centre policy as written under Plan Melbourne 2017-2050, then succeeded by Plan for Victoria 2025. However, there has been little research measuring urban consolidation progress in AC designated areas after Plan Melbourne was released 8 years ago. Therefore, under Crystal Legacy's supervision, I'm doing a research in my thesis called Assessing the Relationships Between Activity Centre or AC policy in Plan Melbourne 2017-2050 and urban consolidation progress in metropolitan Melbourne. With a case study in Sunshine Activity Centre in Sunshine Suburb, I raised some questions in my research. First, what is the policy context for AC's implementation? Second, to what extent does the implementation of ACs reflect its policy ambition? Third, what opportunities exist to advance the implementation of Activity Centre and increase urban consolidation? To answer those questions, my thesis applies policy analysis by looking at Victoria's strategic plans and planning provisions as well as Brimbank planning scheme. Then, I also apply a quantitative descriptive statistics analysis by looking at building approvals for dwellings other than houses, such as apartments, in the last 10 years. Lastly, I'm doing also a media thematic analysis by looking at 75 news articles talking about Activity Centre or AC policy since 2021. My research concludes that first, policy conformity about ACs within and among policy documents is lacking. Put simply, policies is siloed. However, at the same time, I also look at a growing trend of urban consolidation being happened in Sunshine Metropolitan Activity Centre. That's a good news. And lastly, there are some opportunities to advance the implementation of Activity Centre or AC policies, such as providing sufficient infrastructure in AC areas. Second, implementing regulations to protect neighborhood character. And lastly, by ensuring meaningful public participation. While these conclusions do not represent the whole situation in metropolitan Melbourne, it will enrich discussions about how AC policy relates with urban consolidation in this city. Thank you.
Imagine you are an international student who just moved to Tarniat North, an outer suburb of Melbourne. You want to go to your university, but you don't own a car. The nearest station is too far to walk, and there's no regular buses nearby. So you open an app in your phone and book on-demand bus called FlexiRide. It picks you up from your doorstep to go to the station. It sounds convenient, right? Let's see. Hello everyone, I am Fahima. My research is about flexible transport services in Melbourne growth area. So in Melbourne, we often talk about the urban growth, but in fast-growing outer suburbs like Tarniet, that growth has created a serious transport disadvantage. Many residents struggle to travel because the public transport hasn't grown with the community. To fill that gap, the Victorian government has introduced FlexiRide. These services do not follow fixed route. Passengers book through an app or phone line, and the bus dynamically adjusts to pick them up. So what's the problem here? Take a look at my slide. It captures the conflict. On one side, you see politicians celebrating the FlexiRide as a successful transport solution. But on the other side, you see the reality, users complaining about the service. And that's where my research begins. I wanted to find out how effective is this service as perceived by people who rely on them. My study focused on FlexiRide Tarniet North, aiming to evaluate its perceived effectiveness across 6 key factors. I surveyed 41 regular FlexiRide users, conducted 4 interviews with them. So what I found from this: majority of the FlexiRide passengers are young international students, part-time employees, or both. And they heavily depend on public transport for their daily travel needs. This confirms the service is reaching the right people and plays an important role in social. It also functions as a critical first and last mile link, connecting them to Tarniet station for work and study. Also, the analysis revealed while users are satisfied with its affordability and safety, there's a significant service gap in waiting time and reliability of the service. 60% of users reported waiting times that regularly exceeded 20 minutes. Passengers complain about difficulty in booking, inaccurate app tracking, and unavailability of buses during peak hours. It shows operational and technological flaws. More than half of the respondents were neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, suggesting reliance on the service out of necessity rather than genuine satisfaction. My research recommends that a service must meet a minimum threshold of reliability to achieve its social and strategic objectives by implementing technological improvements to enhance on-time performance and waiting time consistency. In future, research could explore travel demand and financial feasibility to understand whether services like FlexiRide can scale up sustainability across other growing suburbs. Thank you.
This morning, I invite you to head 3 hours inland to the beautiful Alps of Victoria's high country. It may constitute less than 4% of the state, but alpine ski resorts, such as Mount Buller, rise proudly from atop these small but mighty mountains. My research focuses on Mount Buller and its only long-term strategic planning document, the Mount Buller Master Plan. This blueprint, first released in 2010, has guided resort development for nearly 20 years, and now is approaching the end of its lifetime. So, my thesis asks, does the Mount Buller Master Plan still reflect the values of its resort community? And who exactly make up that community? Good morning, peers and panelists. My name is Tara, and I've been a part of the Mount Buller ski resort community since I was 3 years old. Like many snow enthusiasts, I grew up skiing, and while I'm no longer in a pink snowsuit and my skis are slightly longer, I've spent every winter at Mount Buller. But as Victoria warms, snow seasons grow shorter, and I had to know how one of Victoria's leading alpine resorts is planning for a warmer future. Because whether you're braving the slopes or relaxing at the spa, there's a mountain of experiences to be had at Mount Buller. My research investigates how those experiences are planned for, especially whether the different people who use the mountain are truly seen and heard in the resort's long-term strategy. I focus on 3 key stakeholder groups that make up the Mount Buller resort community. 1. The residents who live in the ski resort permanently or part-time. 2. Workers and business operators who keep the mountain running. And 3. Guests who visit the resort seasonally or short-term. Drawing on interviews with stakeholder groups and a detailed analysis of the master plan, I reach 3 key findings. First, stakeholders commonly interpreted the master plan as a moving target, one that needs to better bridge what is happening on the ground today with a renewed long-term strategy. Secondly, the plan doesn't fully capture the diverse range of values across these different groups, particularly its responsiveness to changing expectations, uses, and concerns. And finally, the third, alpine resort communities have unique dynamics. They share common motivations and concerns, but also experience tensions between tourism and livability, growth and preservation. Overall, I argue future long-term planning at Mount Buller needs to be meaningfully shaped by its community, by the people who live, work and visit the resort to deliver improved and more inclusive alpine experiences. Because whether you conquer down black runs or pedal up them in summer, it is our shared connection to the mountain that makes Mount Buller a great alpine experience. So one day I hope to pass on my pink snowsuit with the ski goggles to match to the little girl that falls in love with it too.
Sometimes the soul of a city is found at its stables. From morning coffee to late night dinners, Melbourne street hum with the clatter of cutlery and the rhythm of conversation. From hidden laneways to riverside promenades, outdoor dining brings our city to life. Yet every table, every chair exists because someone once had to plan, approve and sometimes fight for it. That made me wonder, how do decisions made in a tribunal room shape the streets we walk and dine every day? My research explores how VCAT, the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, influences outdoor dining as a placemaking strategy in Melbourne CBD. In other words, how planning law meets the city life. Outdoor dining became central to Melbourne's recovery after the pandemic, transforming footpaths into shared spaces of comfort and connection. But behind those vibrant scenes are planning permits, policies, and sometimes disputes, where creativity meets control. To understand this tension, I analyzed 5 VCAT cases from 2014 to 2024, using thematic analysis to explore how tribunal reasonings translated Melbourne's policies on activation, amenity, and heritage into real decisions. Alongside these cases, I also looked into Melbourne's key planning documents, including the Melbourne Planning Scheme with its urban design, heritage, and outdoor dining issues, the post-COVID outdoor dining guidelines, and few more. Together, these sources reveal how policy ambitions meet legal interpretations in practice. These cases include conflicts between restaurant owners seeking vibrancy and residents or councils raising concerns about noise, accessibility, or heritage protection. Across the decision, a clear pattern appeared. VCAT consistently prioritized amenity, accessibility, and heritage values to good planning, while still recognizing the social and economic importance of outdoor dining. Rather than rejecting placemaking, the tribunal reinterpreted it through a legal lens, ensuring that vibrancy and public safety could coexist. This matters because outdoor dining isn't just about food and furniture. It's about how people interact with the city. When law and design work together, our streets become more than corridors of movement. They become places of life, memory, and connection. So the next time you share a meal on Melbourne Street, remember that space isn't just planned, it's negotiated, shaped by the dialogue between law and life. And in that dialogue, we discover what it truly means to plan. Not just cities, but the everyday connection that make them come alive. Thank you.